Ghibli's hierarchy has left many creators over the years without the freedom or opportunity to move up the ranks. This is underlined by the departure of Masashi Ando, Miyazaki's chief animation director. But Miyazaki is now over 60, so in response we see a project to get the new blood into the company, starting with both The Cat Returns and Howl's Moving Castle. After Spirited Away, Miyazaki said,
"At Studio Ghibli, the old main staff is departing, and those of their early 30s will form a new core group. I will also retire from Ghibli and participate from the outside. I look forward to seeing how the staff will react to me as I meddle in their work."
And as you can see, that didn't work out, and a disaster awaits us. A young Toei animation director Mamoru Hosoda was approached by producer Toshio Suzuki after the buzz of his Digimon War Games short. Hosoda had always seen Miyazaki as a great inspiration. His favourite anime film was Castle of Cagliostro, which set him on the path of animation. Hosoda applied for Ghibli at the start of his career, but was rejected. However, Miyazaki did leave him a letter, which said something along the lines of, "I didn't want to stifle your talents." You know, something like that. Hosoda accepted the deal in the new millennium for a spring 2003 release. It is said that the screenplay by Reiko Yoshida, the same as Cat Returns, was finished in around 2001, and from there it was all about the storyboards. However, this was during the Spirited Away production, and there wasn't any animators left, so Hosoda had to go back to his old studio Toei and pick up a bunch of people. And it's said that they were all in a bit of culture shock because of how radically different it was to work at Ghibli in comparison to Toei. Not to mention some of the questionable advice his seniors were giving him at the time.
I remember all the advice that Takahata-san gave me. Some of it didn't make sense. Like, he said, well, Howl is British, so you should make sure that his mouth moves in a British way, which I didn't really understand. He was somewhat strange, Takahata-san.
But when Nozomi Takahashi took over on producer from Toshio Suzuki for unknown reasons, the project pretty much evaporated in place.
I was told to make the movie similar to how Miyazaki would have made it, but I wanted to make my own film, the way I wanted to make it. The difference between the film I wanted to do and how they wanted to do it was too great.
This resulted in the producers rejecting all of Hosoda's future proposals, causing animators to lose their jobs and breaking bonds with Hosoda, himself left high and dry. It all just didn't work out, and the end project was disbanded. All that remains now are a few pictures. The whole situation left Hosoda barraged with questions over the next decades. Toshio Suzuki has been pretty coy on answering them. While he sort of alluded to something in one of the Ghibli textbooks that maybe it was the pressure put on him, or just a radically different way of working that did it, Hosoda, however, has been very blunt about being fired at Ghibli over the years, as Ghibli wanted a puppet Miyazaki to dance on their strings opposed to a new director with a new vision. And in retrospect, he thinks it might have been a good thing, because if the film had failed, he would have had to take responsibility for something that wasn't his own, and then the consequences that came with that, and haven't we seen something similar before? Speaking of Earthsea, I wonder if the producers here and Suzuki are being a little bit devious with the author Diane Jones. And some of the stuff that happened with Earthsea could make that seem a little bit likely, because that didn't exactly go the way it was planned either. Especially if you go on what Stephen Alpert said around this time about meeting Diane Jones. Her one condition for the approval of the book was that it had to be directed by Miyazaki. And this all happened around the time of Hosoda getting fired. So maybe those are connected, I don't know. Only a few months later, Miyazaki is convinced to rescue the project, which would be animated in over a year, which is very wishful thinking. Although, to give some lenience to these producers, originally it was only supposed to be 80 minutes long, But we know that that's just not how this goes with Miyazaki. After all, his first proposal was apparently going to be 6 hours long. So, yeah. Not really one for thinking small, he's too idealistic. In fact, during this production, him and director Mamoru Oshii got into a bit of a spat when it came to the realities of the industry. It's rather the heart of the artist!
The situation has been the same for 20 years!
At the same time as Howl's Moving Castle, Ghibli co-produced Oshii's Ghost in the Shell Innocence, creating its advertising campaign, with many Ghibli staffers working alongside the Innocence teams, splitting resources. Moreover, Miyazaki needed a new animation director. Takeshi Inamura was approached by Miyazaki. He rose through the company ranks and became an animation director for Ghibli's short Whale Hunt. But a whole movie is something else. He couldn't do it alone, but when Akihiko Yamashita agreed to be part of the team, Inamura was on board. On paper, Yamashita was an unorthodox choice. At the time, one of his biggest credits would be the character designer of the infamous Legend of the Overfiend series. Google it. But that's not to denigrate Yamashita. He had been recognized for his outstanding talent early in his career. See Ghibli's future golden boy, Takeshi Honda.
Before I joined Gainax, I was working in a place called Atelier Giga. That was the first studio that I joined. Yamashita wasn't that old. He was probably only a year or two older than me, but he was so talented, and I thought, wow, someone my age is doing such a great job. I was really impressed and really surprised.
Even Miyazaki himself had called him a rare animator in this age, one who was solid, something that frustrated him in the later years, as it was hard to keep good talent. Therefore, after seeing Yamashita's work on Spirited Away, he was quick to offer him an animation direction job for his next film. Yamashita took on the major role of correction, while Inamura did cleanup supervision. Together they would labour on the character designs, which were a departure from prior Ghibli. The protagonists had more complex designs, with Howl's colourful outfits and Sophie's rapid aging.
During the pre-production period before the production officially began, I first began by teaming up with supervising animator Takeshi Inamura to create the character designs. All I did at first, every day, was draw sketches of all the characters. I must have drawn 50 to 60 sheets of the main characters Howl and Sophie. I would try out various face types and proportions, then show the sketches to Miyazaki for feedback. Inamura and I would also show each other our work. We finalized the character designs about 10 days before the production began.
The animation directors said it was a pretty girl meets pretty boy story. Since the approach here was all impulse with few explanations, the emotions needed to be reflected through their designs, but also the magical journey. So they'll need more than 2 animators to do that. The majority of the animators here in Howl's Moving Castle worked on the prior movie, with mainstays like Atsuko Tanaka, who was returning for her 8th role on a Miyazaki film. Here's her legendary breakfast cut, which she completed in its entirety, working on more than 150 cuts throughout the entire movie. In order to do this, she recorded reference of bacon and eggs, but mainly just to eat them afterwards. Tanaka tried to make the sequence look like Go Panda Go, which was Miyazaki's first food sequence, wink wink, but she struggled a lot and caused the animation director Yamashita a lot of trouble, but you can't argue with those results. One of their favourite animators was Shinya Ohira, who returns on Howl's Moving Castle with another standout sequence, morphing and busting in this dreamlike landscape. His cut breaks through the reality of Miyazaki's images, even when corrected. It brings a unique flair. Which you'd expect from one of the best animators in the industry. And that could also be said of veterans like Megumi Kagawa, although they didn't make too many cuts for this film as they struggled with the more complex new designs. The level of detail slowed everything down, especially when your speciality is character animation. Now, Kagawa has been working with Miyazaki for many decades, and when asked during this production how it is, she said he's older and less angry and spiteful now, which, yay! But also he seemed weaker, and because of that she felt like she needed to do more for old Grandpa Miyazaki this time around. There does seem to be a misconception about how the staff interpret Miyazaki's work.
He's really good at communicating what he wants us to draw. He won't teach us all the details, but he'll tell us what kind of image he's looking for. It's our job to interpret what kind of image he has, though with just one word, he enables us to expand that image. He's also very scary. He won't allow mistakes.
With Miyazaki's case, he leaves the animators free to make the layouts however they choose, and it's during the key animation stage that he starts actually considering how things will move and how things should act. But he only checks the key animation, then he might rethink stuff and add corrections and add stuff that isn't even in the storyboard, which sounds a bit like a disaster if you ask me. Now, the layout goes on to define the shape of the movie, opposed to the storyboard. Now, what is the layout? Well, it's the skeleton for all the animation work to be built off. It makes an expansion of the storyboard with backgrounds and camera movement and all that stuff added on top, while filling in a lot of those in-between actions the storyboard didn't cover. It's those boards though that Miyazaki struggled with, and while A and B were completed before the production really started going, and the rest came like blood from a stone. Generally with anime storyboards, the ones you see that are finally produced at the end are actually reworked to look closer than the movie in most accounts, as things change a lot during the layout position. However, Toshiyuki Inoue has said that doesn't seem to really be the case with Miyazaki. Usually his stuff is pretty set. When it's down and you just follow it. But that might not actually be the case with Howl's Moving Castle, as there are some staff that seem to be alleging that the layouts were actually helping Miyazaki with his direction of his storyboards as he was really struggling. Even if the production isn't going to mention that because it affects the whole image of the omnipotence of the director. Inoue also argues that the Miyazaki approach is quite flawed because he's basically using these animators as a springboard to add his ideas on. He actually thinks that Miyazaki should be doing this himself to basically save time because of all the reworking and mess that it comes across later. But you know, you're not going to change his mind. Miyazaki boards already need amazing animators to make them function because of how technical they are. Even if it is simple to look at, it's very hard to create. And if you don't live up to Miyazaki's standards, then he might accidentally do the animation himself, like he apparently did on several of these calcifer shots.
Curses are tough. You're gonna have a very hard time getting rid of that one.
As time went on, they needed a new animation director, Kitaro Kosaka, one of Miyazaki's supervising specialists. He returned in the summer, as he was away working on his directorial debut, Nasu Summer in Andalusia, which to Miyazaki's credit was his idea as both were avid cyclists. Kitaro Kosaka's input brought a healthier production, correcting the action sequences and complicated cuts. That said, the demands of the schedule were becoming apparent. Even as they broke records, in some instances they still struggled to keep deadline, as there was a constant concern from the production staff that they just couldn't handle creating another terrible Spirited Away situation. So we're in the classic situation where Miyazaki has halted on the storyboards, which means we don't have enough storyboards to create the layouts. We don't have enough layouts to create key animation, and the key animators haven't produced enough for the animation directors to check. It's creating a huge delay in the system, which means that you can basically never hit those schedules, no matter how good you are doing. Because at some points, they were hitting 3,000 drawings a week, which is a new record. But when you don't know how many cuts there's going to be, or how many drawings there need to be, it doesn't really matter. I mean, technically this film's shorter, but there's just way more drawings than there has been before, so none of that's really going to help you in the end. Working at Ghibli is obviously no easy ride. You can look at people like animation checker Tateno, who said that she was not allowed to get married because of specifically Miyazaki and Suzuki while she worked there. Just on top of that, you can imagine like, you have to do all those crazy cuts on paper. You're not allowed to do them digitally. No. Miyazaki doesn't get that stuff. So when it comes to those big monsters and vehicle shots, that's all by hand. And this is a man who was so infamously particular, he used to complain when the birds didn't fly the way he wanted to. So the animators have already lost before they've started. So the lack of boards in the winter meant inevitably we're going to have to go into an animator crunch to finally try and hit a deadline, which is going to go all the way to burnout. Wow, that sounds like it was a real difficult time in everyone's lives, huh? Speaking of difficult times in everyone's lives, I've been unmedicated while working to a deadline on this project, and it's gone pretty difficultly, but we're almost at the end here. I'm recording the final bits now, and of course when it comes to little plushie, if you want to support the channel, got a little fella here. He's pretty cool. And for everyone who's already supporting the channel, I need to give a big thanks to Lenny, Tim James Richards, Joven, Daniel Strait, Askar Rao, Stratogen Stratos, Chunks, Jay, Fox Mulder, OT, Paul, Stephen's mum, Subsofa, Takayuki Suzuki, Systematic, Karen, Nick, Doji, Peter, and new people, Vic Boss, and I think you'd say Yegor, Thank you very much for joining. The videos themselves, I write them, edit them, animate them all myself, and that's part of the plan. So if you want to see more content coming along your ways, support is always helpful to keep it running. Despite Miyazaki not understanding computers, Howl had over 200 digital cuts throughout the movie, taking the tech further than any prior Ghibli movies. And while the storyboard set all that down on paper, it's Howl's digital team that had to make it all come together. Howl also used other digital effects, such as toon shaders, to create cell-like images. The biggest of these would be the castle as a moving harmony painting. Now what is a harmony? Well, let's go into lecture mode with STEVEM. It's a cell that is painted like an illustration because it does not animate, it slides. If they need to move it, they will simply transform it into a cell. The smell of old poster paint filled the room with nostalgia as harmony painters stayed up until the midnight hour to finish these paintings because they changed with every shot. Ghibli did a similar process for Nausicaa with the Olm bugs, but every facet of the castle here had to be cut out and collaged back together to move in a cutout fashion. Now through the power of digital technology, merging traditional and digital in a way we've never seen before, using these digital puppet strings to make it all come together. They also needed to stitch those paintings over the CG walking legs. The animator's approach was to merge a lizard walk cycle with an animation CGI walk cycle. Its unsteady walk gave the character of the castle a personality of its own, one at a time that was very difficult to achieve in Japan through CG. As they said in their previous CG works, it had mainly been around background art, but this time they worked on something that had to deal with more dynamic movements. And they've really never had to focus on character movements like that before, really having to think now what it means to be a performance. It's actually unusual to still use poster paints in anime cells at this point. Nowadays, the majority of Ghibli movies are digitally painted. Spirited Away was outsourced to Dr. Movie. While they were a defining factor in making that movie hit its deadline, it wasn't practical for them to check all the work back and forth from two different countries, as Dr. Movie was Korean, which led to some animation in Spirited Away not getting checked as thoroughly as the director would have liked. So a Japanese company was chosen here, T2. As they were a Tokyo painting company, it made more sense for them, since they were used for pretty much all of Ghibli's later movies. Though they still worked in collaboration with the colour department of Ghibli to create the sort of vibrant and multifaceted changes in colours. There seems to be more variety than there has been before. The summer deadline seemed like a distant dream by the time of January 2004 because the storyboards were still not done, and only half the movie was complete. The new release would be November 2004, which is unconventional for Ghibli, who always release in the summer. And this gave a lot of departments leeway they don't usually get, so that's a good thing, but it's actually never happened before. Miyazaki's usually so dead set on getting the movie out that he forces it, but this time it just wasn't possible. However, the movie still needed to be finished by August so they could get it to the Venice Film Festival. After all, that's quite important for prestige. Now by March, the fatigue had set in, since it had been about 3 months of work non-stop, and from there it was still several months before they'd actually see the end of key animation. And then say, by about the end of July, key animation in betweens and painting was all done, and by the beginning of August, the movie is now complete, just in time for that September Venice Film Festival release. Now I'm sure this shows the problems with the Miyazaki approach, but it is a good thing they did push it back in the end. It is a step in the right direction when it comes to protecting the staff, some of them at least. Even if we are about 20 years away from the no crunch approach approved in Boy and the Heron, it's a step in the right direction. Now there's actually 4,000 more frames in this movie than Spirited Away, and it has a month less or so in its production of animation, so that it all came together. It's actually very impressive when you think about it like that. Well, I guess as long as you don't count the whole debacle with Hosoda, we just ignore that part of the production completely. So as the follow-up of the biggest Japanese movie of all time, there's a lot of buzz about how they would approach this, but Suzuki had an unorthodox method, one that could be considered quite bold, advertising without advertising. Now what does that mean? Well, it's not exactly no press, but they were going for something a lot more minimal than before, something that has more relied on word of mouth and not exactly explaining what the story was going to be or its themes, etc. Spirited Away had such a massive campaign, in comparison they were going very minimal, and keeping it a little bit more mysterious until the release date. Now you could say it was bold, but it might actually have more stinky intentions than we first thought.
I envy you. If you advertise a movie, you always get a hit. I couldn't help but raise my voice and bid in reply. If that were the case, how easy my life would be. Take Howl's Moving Castle, for example. Our principal advertising strategy was we wouldn't advertise. Ordinarily, advertising presents the essence of a product. This time, though, rather than trying to do that, we were going to limit the amount of information offered.
It seems even the ego of Miyazaki was pushed a bit when he was told, yeah, this film's good, but the advertising was amazing. And that kind of got him thinking, like, well, is the movie even good to begin with? So this is almost like a solidification of how they needed to prove that. And it's not exactly the boy in the heron's no press approach, though it probably would have been the template as we go forward. And considering how much money has went into this production and how much they're expecting to make, it seems pretty difficult, especially when they are basically saying this film will not do well in the States.
All I can say with considerable confidence is that any films I make in the future will never be big hits in the United States. Around the time of the war with Iraq, I even made a slightly conscious effort to create a film that wouldn't be very successful in the United States.
When it comes to the Iraq War, yeah, Miyazaki had made statements about how he was annoyed about the approach George Bush had taken, and the news was all over the place. You couldn't escape it. So it ended up in the film in some ways. In fact, if I understand right, there wasn't even a war in the original book. But when we look at the film, there isn't really much of an iconography connection to the Iraq War outside of the time and culture that it was created. In fact, Miyazaki said in a later point that was almost intentional because he didn't want to use the imagery as the invasion started to break out and getting more intense. Maybe that was a little too hot for him to touch. So what you get in the end is something which has more universal anti-war themes overall, especially when it comes to like the bombings that seem more equivalent to the fire bombings in Japan that Miyazaki himself experienced. But that's not to say this doesn't work as a metaphor, because you can kind of see within the movie's structure that the longer the character Howl is at war, the more he loses humanity and the person he wants to be in the first place. So that more universal approach is probably maybe the better way of going overall.
What is that thing doing out here?
A battleship?
Still looking for more cities to burn.
Is it the enemy's or one of ours?
What difference does it make?
Although it did only make half the money it was spirited away at the box office, so maybe they were correct on that one. When it comes to adaptation, Hosoda's version, while set in the modern day originally, seemed to be quite close to the book in format, even with its floating castle opposed to the walking castle we've become quite acquainted to now. But when it comes to Miyazaki, he's known to be a very loose adapter, and it's even written to the contracts. It's not like they didn't know that, like there's a clause all about it, and the novelist did accept that because they said as long as the characters are close enough, then it's fine. They can do what they want with their adaptation. It's an adaptation after all. And even if there might be some hearsay, the original author was actually a big fan of the movie. It was premiered in Aardman in Bristol, represent, and it sounds like she had a great time. In fact, as she says here,
I was overwhelmed, actually. I thought it was wonderful. It was rich and strange, full of the most beautiful animation. And I was just, sort of thrown back in my seat.
Especially when, after the film came out, her books saw massive upticks in sales, so it all worked out well for her. So, happy author. Now, when it came to the Japanese audience, that might have not been as smooth, because the crew basically say that there was quite a polarized response to the movie. Some people who really liked it and some people who didn't get it at all because of the more impulsive approach it took. And you can see it kind of reflected in the more modern Japanese polls, as it sort of ranks a lot lower than other movies from Miyazaki in this era. Now, that's not to say it didn't win any awards. It did win some Japanese awards and international awards. It had some prestige there, but not quite in the way they wanted it to be. Mamoru Oshii actually responded that this is his favourite Miyazaki movie, though he is quite the contrarian. Maybe he's also a little bit biased because he had a little cameo in the movie too, if you look close enough. And I gotta say, personally, my favourite of those big three, absolutely hands down. Even if it's a little compromised in areas, I think that it is one with some of the most beautiful images, and I really like the family dynamic. It's kino. So maybe I'm a bit of a contrarian too, I suppose. I don't knock the animation quality 1 second, and I don't think most people would, because Yamashita was really knocking out of the park, and you can see why he was picked on to do about a fourth of the animation cuts in The Boy and the Heron. But radical change was coming. The removal of Takuma Shoten in their joint plan. You see, after the death of the president, they kind of saw the writing on the wall. They wanted to move away from having the responsibility to being connected to that company, and that gives them more leeway about how they approach the future as they decide to go in maybe a different path than they originally planned.
We don't know why, but it had very extreme reactions. People who really loved it and people who didn't understand it. It was a horrible experience. I've been so tired since Princess Mononoke. And to continue this complicated direction, I thought, we can't do this anymore. Mononoke Spirited Away, Howl, we decided to change directions. And that's why we did Ponyo the way we did.
Now, the disaster is a culmination of all the problems we talked about in the last 3 videos, which you can watch down there. Wink, wink, wink. Starting with, Miyazaki is getting old and he's having a harder time dealing with the burnout. And that's also hurting the staff. Some of them leave, some of them don't get on well with the project, others are hospitalized. And on top of that, they just can't hit those unrealistic deadlines that are pushed upon them, which is also just becoming harder as the realities of the industry are coming right into their faces. They can't get enough high quality staff together. Next, you got his age. They are afraid of having a studio without these massive creators. They want an heir, but they can't get one, and the producers are making it worse by the day, and to this day there is no successor. Following on to, it wasn't the critical darling that they would have liked it to be. Sure, some awards, but it seemed mentally to have hurt their prestige, which in some part might be why Miyazaki has said allegedly that he regretted making it. I mean, it wasn't his movie to begin with, and that comes down to the change in direction we're going to see into the future. While House Moving Castle was a commercial success, it did not beat Spirited Away, it did not break that barrier, and it failed to build on the momentum of Spirited Away in the States. You could say House Moving Castle is a successful failure.